Small business confidence declining the most since the start of the pandemic. That's the latest from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and MetLife with their third quarter 2022 small business index. And the index went from around 66.8% in the previous quarter to 62.1% in the third quarter. And that's the, again, largest decline since the start of the pandemic. Small business index right before the pandemic was like 75. Things were looking good. And then when the pandemic hit and all the restrictions that were put in place on economic activity and education and so on, you look at this report and it just shows it plummeting quite a bit down into, I believe, the 50s. But it's come up a bunch. However, in the most recent quarter, it's dropped the most since that precipitous decline right as the pandemic hit. So I talked with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Vice President for Small Business Policy, Tom Sullivan, and we discussed what the outcome of this survey ultimately indicates and what the future portends, because there's a whole host of issues that you small businesses have to deal with, but we as the end-line consumer, we're right there with you. We're going to be having to help pay for increased costs by increased, service fees or increased prices that small businesses are having to do in order to make up for their chief concern, inflation. But here's Tom Sullivan talking a bit about just what are some of the top line issues that small businesses are having to contend with in the most recent third quarter small business survey.
It probably is not going to be a surprise to your listeners. Inflation continues to be the strongest headwind facing small businesses. I think the bad news is that while some kind of stock indices and other things say that with the cost of gas going down a little bit, inflation isn't as bad, that's certainly not what we're hearing from small businesses who say that inflation is absolutely top of mind for every one of them, and that, unfortunately, this survey shows that 7 in 10 small businesses say that the worst is yet to come.
So inflation a major issue, and 7 of 10 businesses don't see inflation subsiding enough to make a true impact. But what about, we saw previous quarterly reports indicating that U.S. GDP has declined in 2 consecutive quarters. That signals recession to a lot of people. Others trying to dance around that and say, well, it's the hiring numbers are still strong and spending is still high and we're not in a technical recession, some might say. But what does this indicate? Where are we heading? Towards a recession? What do businesses have to say about this? Here's Tom Sullivan from the U.S. Chamber.
All right. Well, so our index does not ask small businesses to be economists, primarily because they're already expected to be the custodian, the accountant, the lawyer, and everything else. I think when I was working at small businesses, I think the chief bottle washer was a lot of times what small businesses owners would describe themselves. So I don't want to impose on them the additional job responsibility of being an economist. What we do here, though, is that most small businesses, in order to deal with inflation, are raising prices. And so that can only go on for so long. It is not easy for a small business owner to raise a price because they are always fearful of ultimately, at some point, losing their customers, where they have spent so much effort trying to build a customer base and build sales. To even potentially jeopardize those sales is terrifying for small business owners. So what we see is small business owners having to raise prices just to keep up with costs, but there is a growing anxiety of not ultimately being able to keep up with inflation. And that's really the story behind really the biggest drop of small business confidence since the beginning of the pandemic. We saw the difference between quarter 2 and quarter 3. We saw a drop of 4.7 points. And again, that's the largest drop since the pandemic. So it's something that we're concerned with. It's something that we're digging in even more deeply with small business owners. However, we still hear from small businesses that they want to grow. And that's where the second headwind really is hitting small businesses, and that is the worker shortage. This is, again, Greg, this is not going to surprise any of your listeners. The ability to find, hire, and keep willing employees is very, very hard right now. So it's good news, bad news. The good news is small business owners want to grow, and that says to me that there's optimism underneath these difficult numbers. The bad news is they can't find employees to grow, and that combined with inflation and higher costs is what accounts for the drop in small business confidence that we're seeing.
Again, sharing some of the conversation I had yesterday with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Vice President of Small Business Policy, Tom Sullivan. A new report out this morning from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and you can see the report if you go to my YouTube or my Twitter. Too many social media accounts. If you go to my Twitter account, Bishop on Air, you'll be able to see the article I put together for the Center Square. But ultimately, it's highlighting how we have less confidence among small businesses, and that is going to impact further the end consumer, you and I, who support these small businesses. And because inflation is the driving concern, you can expect to pay higher prices as small businesses have to continue to contend with higher prices. But what about the pandemic? We heard the president say that the pandemic is over. One of the chief concerns a year ago in the Small Business Index from the U.S. Chamber was COVID mitigations. But that seems to have subsided quite a bit because of something, again, you're hearing more and more about, and that's record inflation. Here's Tom Sullivan.
Front and center on small businesses' concern is inflation. And so from the question of is the pandemic there or not, it's hidden, like if it is, it's hidden pretty deeply behind the massive thing called inflation that is front of mind for every small business owner. So it's not if something exists or not. It's just that inflation is there from the moment a small business owner wakes up till the moment that the small business owner goes to sleep, if they are sleeping at all. And our index shows that if given the choice, I'm trying to look at this, the index here, if given a choice, the majority of small businesses say reducing inflation has got to be our country's priority.
So I asked, how do we ultimately solve these issues? And he said that policymakers need to really look at what small businesses need. And he said that goes from those leaders in Chicago to Springfield to Washington, D.C. And ultimately what those things are, crystallizing it down, he says, to put it bluntly, is they need to be able to hire more people and be given a pathway to do that with the least resistance.
I think the question that every small business owner should ask their elected leader is, how can you make it easier for me to hire one more employee?
So you can see more about the Small Business Index. The Midwest and the South are doing much better than the East and West coasts, but still across the board, across the country, small businesses have less confidence going into the future than they did in the previous quarter. So fascinating to hear about that. How that plays into the election, who knows? But we'll be watching all of this.